You also face criticism because once you put yourself out there, all of a sudden people begin to take their shots. Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, you've made many visits there. I remember, I guess in '09, I was trying to interview you, and you were actually shooting a movie, I believe, down there.
I was trying to shoot a movie on the Haitian Revolution. It was President Hugo Chavez who embraced the idea around the issues of Afro-descendants, and one of the things that we've been working on, others, my friend James Early from the Smithsonian and others, is creating this relationship between what has happened with Afro-descendants in the hemisphere. There are 150 million African descendants in the southern hemisphere. In the hemisphere, 90% of them live in poverty. And what's happening with these extraordinary moments in grassroots democracy and reimagining democracy all over the hemisphere is that there's a place for African descendants. You know, Brazilians, 90%, 90 million people of African descent live in Brazil. Colombia, all these questions are happening about here. And it's been exciting to watch them as they interface with the dynamics that are changing in their country. Yeah, you're going to get criticized, but when this guy when Hugo Chavez said, look at my hair, my grandmother was African, you know what I'm saying? How can you want to talk to him and find out how can we find ways in which that direct experience, that experience translates into kind of changes that need to happen in your country, but also in the hemisphere as well.
And the reason I brought that up, because you approach that not thinking of, oh, here are the geopolitical interests of political folks in Washington, D.C. What you're actually doing is going back historically 200, 300, 400 years to say, look, there's a lineage here, a connection here that goes beyond what you want it to be in terms of, in America, no, we don't like that person because we think he's socialist. We don't like Castro for these reasons. You're saying, no. This is there's a different dynamic, different connection here.
It's a different dynamic and different connection. And the most important thing about the process is something is happening in the region. Something has happened different in the region. When you're in the Organization of American States, when you get the vote of 30-2, there's something happening not only in Latin America with those countries who are the usual suspects, you know, whether it's Bolivia or whether it's Ecuador or whether it's Venezuela, or what you have is also that resonating, or Nicaragua, resonating with Caribbean countries and other countries that are part of the Organization of American States. So something is happening in the region. And maybe we could learn a great deal about this whole reimagination of democracy. What is exceptional in this region? To have an indigenous man elected president of a country who comes out of a movement, a social movement, around the deregulation or the privatization of water in this country, to who he is, or to have a woman, the president of the 6th largest economy in the world, who was actually a woman who had been tortured and had fought in an attempt to change her country. That's what I consider to be exceptional in a way, and to be able to talk to these people in a sense. Because what is evident and what we realize is that something is changing in the world, whether if we look at the EU and what is happening with the virtual collapse of the EU, a virtual collapse within the context of the existing economic paradigm. And at the same time, you have a country like Argentina who walks away from the World Bank, establishes another relationship in terms of ALBA and other relationships. Where do you find the relationship between PetroCaribe, which provides discount oil for Caribbean countries? You watch all these things happening, and you want to question, what if? Because it's all in our imagination. What did Einstein say? Imagination is more important and more powerful than knowledge. So it's all in our imagination. So we can create the relationship, the kind of relationships that King talks about in his beloved community. We can create the relationships in our imagination. How do they manifest themselves from people to people within the nation state, and how do they manifest themselves from nation state to nation state?
I remember when we had the Arab Spring, I remember I was watching one of the television broadcasts, and all I kept hearing in the discussion was, what are the American interests in this? And I'm sitting at home going, isn't it their country? Shouldn't the conversation be, what do the people of Egypt care about?
Yeah.
And I'm curious to hear from you what is happening in Northern Africa when you had folks in Egypt who were wearing "I am a man" signs, the exact same signs they were wearing in Memphis.
Dr. King
was killed.
The sanitation workers.
When you see, and you travel the world, when you see folks in these countries saying, we don't want to be oppressed, but at the same time, we don't want anyone on the outside trying to tell us how we should run our countries. Your take on what is happening in Northern Africa in these different spots around the world?
Well, I think what is happening in Northern Africa is just that, and whether it's in Syria, whether it's happening in Tunisia, whether it's happening in Egypt, or whether it's happening in other places. And I mean, the great fear is that now we're going to have this turn within the relationships, the shift within the relationships and power within the region itself. And it all comes from the bottom up. But look here, you look at in this region, you look at Raul Castro. He said everything is on the table except one thing, our sovereignty. He was very clear about that. We can talk about everything, but we can't talk about our sovereignty. The whole idea, and this is the whole idea of the nation state. When we go back to Machiavelli and everybody else, as the nation state forms, you look at the beginning at post-World War II. All these national insurrections, all these national movements around decolonization. It was not any kind of ideological struggle. It's about the nation state and nationalism, people's sovereignty.
We want to control our own destiny.
We want to control our own destiny. That's what this is about. In 1939, the United States controlled 70%. Britain controlled 70% of the oil in the region. Now, the United States controls 70% of the oil. You know what I'm saying? So there's something about what's happening here, and I think we have to rethink this in terms of that. We've used our extraordinary power and our extraordinary exceptionalism as the leader of the global democracy in some sense, and whatever is controlling a lot of people's life, determining what people had to do if they were to play, if they were to play along with the game. If they didn't play along with the game, and which is obvious, if they didn't play along with the game, they were demonized. And I'm not saying some of the guys who didn't play along with the game were bad actors anyway.
Right.
There's no doubt about it. But when I look at the bad actor, I said, who puts Saddam Hussein into power in 1965 or 68? Who sets the road for him into power?
Oh, same thing when what is now BP, Anglo-Iranian Oil, controlled Iran. We overthrew Mossadegh in 1954.
Mossadegh in 1953.
Right.
So you look at this and say, if you have at the outset of this movement, at the outset when they win their independence, Iraq, when their independence, you have primarily in civil society, you have an extraordinary pluralistic dialogue that's happening about nationalism. Iran, Iraq. That's what you have. You have this incredible. Mossadegh was a nationalist leader. He was someone who said, look here, this oil belongs to us. In the midst of all the nationalism that takes place, this oil belongs to this country. We should decide how we use this oil. But he wasn't playing along with the game. And so what you do is you overthrow him. Or you put the Shah, you set up a situation with Saddam Hussein, who is now placed into power, someone who we all knew was ruthless, placed into power in 1968.
But that was cool with us when we were fine with it.
We were cool with us. So you look at this in a way, and for those countries who stood up to that, and tried to stay up there, those are the ones who are often the ones who we really put the screws to. You talk about the Arab Spring. I say, well, what about 1986 and the Haitian Spring? When people overthrew Baby Doc, people protested, and elected their president. He didn't have no money to run, but they elected their president. What happens? He begins to talk about reparations. He began to talk about raising the minimum wage for working workers. All those things. What happens? A coup happens.
You're speaking of Aristide.
I'm taking the Aristide. So we were able to see what happens with this whole process, you know, and yet at the same time, people's spirit, their spirit is indomitable. They go on, they move on. The Haitian people say, okay, you want us to vote somebody else, we think we vote for Proval and tear down the fence to make them to vote for Proval. You allow us, you say this is the limitation that we have, and we exceed the limitation, but the Haitians have a history of doing that stuff.
Right. For the moment, they're independent.
They don't sit around the house, man.